Okay, so at this point, I'd like to introduce Tom Chase, member of our board of directors, who will introduce tonight's speaker. So, Tom, take it away.
Thank you, Dave. Tonight's program is about a train wreck in northeastern Connecticut, but not the 1891 East Townsend 4 train wreck that you heard me talk about before. Tonight's is the 1918 Pomfret wreck. They both happened on the same route, the airline, later the Midland Division of the New Haven. Telegraphy problems contributed to both wrecks, and Stewart Chute will tell you more. He's a retired research toxicologist with an interest in railroads and history. As a boy, he loved to watch and listen to the massive freights as they dragged down the Pennsylvania Railroad main line through southwest central Pennsylvania. In his youth, he collected books on railroad history and also built prototypical models. I was interested that he was excited to have a picture of his modeling work published in Model Railroader magazine. He presently serves on the board of the Pomfret, Connecticut Historical Society and also enjoys hiking, singing in a choir, and making wood moldings in the old-fashioned way. Stewart, please take us back to 1918 Pomfret.
Thank you, first of all, Tom, for that wonderful introduction. And thanks also to everyone for being here. I appreciate your interest, and I hope that I'll make it worth your time. So let's get rolling here. First, I'd like to start with this map from 1893 of the major rail routes in Connecticut. This was published by the New York and New England Railroad, so we see its lines in bold. But note here that Willimantic was pretty much a hub for several different lines, at least three. The New York, New England, and also the New York, New Haven, and Hartford. And also a hub for fast passenger service at this time, going through Willimantic and changing lines and then continuing on to New York. What, however, we're going to be focusing on in this particular presentation is this area here in the circle. That is the area between Willimantic and Putnam. So we're going to focus on these two trains that wrecked. They started in Willimantic and they were bound for Putnam. So today, this line, this so-called airline, is a state park. And if you haven't visited, I would really highly recommend it. It's a great place for hiking, for bicycling, for horseback riding, and it's obviously a great place for dog walking too, because I see a lot of people on it. So here are just the basic facts of what we are going to be talking about tonight. So in 1918, two eastbound New York, New Haven, and Hartford freight trains collided 3,100 feet east of the Pomfret station. 5 people were dead and 3 injured. So the second train was the one that crashed into the first train, was a doubleheader, AB4, and it hit the rear of an extra freight, number 3200, at a location called Sugarloaf Cut, which is just east of the Pomfret station, on a dark and misty April morning. So starting with an outline, what I'd like to cover tonight, we're going to look at 4 different aspects here. First, I'm going to overview the origins of the railroad service in Northeast Connecticut. Secondly, I'd like to describe the wreck and the circumstances leading up to it. Thirdly, I'll outline the operating challenges for the U.S. railroads during this era. And lastly, I'll be describing how train control systems failed in the days leading up to the wreck, that is April 10th. So let's start by looking at the development of railroads in Northeast Connecticut. Well, here we have an analogy between life stages of, let's say, human different life stages and that of a railroad. So I've divided this up into 5 different life stages. First, the inception from 1847 to 1872. Secondly, we're going to call it the fast passenger age from 1872 to 1902. Thirdly, the slow and heavy freight days from 1902 to 1955. That's when the New Haven had taken over the line from the New York and New England. The fourth phase of actually I call the senescence, well, whatever, the abandonment process. And now what is happening today, what is still happening, is reincarnation into a state park. So stage 1, we're looking at some speculators, some famous speculators who were eager at this time to back what they saw as the airline concept, which was the idea that the distance between New York and Boston, and that is really hot market, say, is a more or less straight line that led through Willimantic. So the prospects were lucrative because there was a large market in New York City and Boston. And, you know, they had the shortest route, as I mentioned, and also, you know, it's a chance to offer exclusive and profitable service. I mean, it's like business class service out in the day. Yet it took 26 years to realize this, which is about the same length as the whole life stage here. And that was because of confounding things like speculation, bankruptcies, corruption, politics, rivalries, and also weight and speed restrictions. And it wasn't really a straight line, folks. It was a lot of curves and grades. It was not a great terrain for a railroad. And here on this little picture here from 1870, we've got Commodore Vanderbilt and then his rival Jim Fisk, two financial buccaneers who were fighting at the time over access to New York City. So stage 2, we're going to move into the era from that map that I showed you on the first slide. That is the era of intercity passenger service. Again, a business class type of service of an exclusive clientele, but also some mutual dependency here. As I alluded to, the New York and New England owned connections to Boston, but the New York, New Haven, and Hartford owned connections to New York City. So they had to cooperate, and they pretty much met in Willimantic. And one had to change a locomotive in Willimantic. But, you know, sometimes they cooperated and sometimes they didn't. But in general, it was cutthroat. So in 1893, around 1893, 1895, the New York and New England was forced to reorganize. They just were not in good financial shape. And later on, they were leased a couple years later, leased by the New York, New Haven, and Hartford, and which soon afterwards purchased the sale of New York and New England. Here's a picture of the Lyman Viaduct in East Hampton, a spectacular piece of infrastructure, which must have been something to travel over that. Must have been a little shaky. I see here there's only one track on that at this point. There must be room for 2, though. But that was filled in much later. Well, actually, not very much later, but it doesn't exist anymore. Anyway, here's what the general manager, Charles S. Mellon, said. It was the worst form of cutthroat competition I've experienced in 44 years. So we'll hear a little bit more about Mr. Mellon later on in the program here. The third life, this is the life of the wreck, the time of the wreck. This is when New Haven was in control, and they were using it for slow and heavy freight trains, and they chose to run their fast freight and their fast passengers instead along the shoreline route. So this was the Midland Division here, running through Willimantic and Pomfret. But they usually just put the slow trains on it because the trackage was not so good. So typically they'd be carrying low value items like coal, lumber, and grain with only local passenger service. And as I mentioned, speed restrictions and sometimes some heavy, powerful locomotives. So here's a photo of a typical mogul locomotive of the era. This was very common in the day for New York, New Haven, and Hartford. And I put this in here because two of these K1Bs were on the AB4 train that ran into the back of the extra 3200. It's also interesting. It's looks like it's running extra here with a white flag. I think that's a white flag. And old headlamp, old oil headlamp too. So it was not upgraded. Anyway, the process of senescence, the abandonment of the rail began pretty much after a big flood. In this picture, we see the Quinnebog River and the rail line as it entered Putnam. So looks to me like the bank was washed out, a pier came down, and the bridge collapsed. This bridge was not rebuilt as a railroad bridge, but today one can walk a footbridge, which passes right through the middle of this pier and takes you on into Putnam along the airline trail. So a good sharp picture. And this is what it looks like today, right pretty much in my backyard. This is in Hampton. It's the grade from the airline trail. And this is what you see when you go hiking. Note that it still looks to be somewhat like dual track. Anyway, it's a beautiful place to spend an afternoon. So let's move to talk about the accident. So we're going to look at how it happened, who died, and who was given the blame. I'm going to be focusing on the blame later on. So first off, let's take the first locomotive, the Extra 3200. This is a photograph of an L1 class locomotive, a 210-2 wheel arrangement. So its sister, number 3200, was Extra 3200 on that day of April 10th. It included 34 freight cars weighing about 1,500 tons. And due to the poor trackage, which I've alluded to several times, its speed was limited to 15 miles per hour. So it's a beast, very powerful, has some nice modern details to it, like an electric light and an Alesto feedwater heater. Looks like it's got set up for a run. It's got a full load of coal. And maybe that's the engineer getting in there ready to go. Some stats, this little lady weighed almost 500,000 pounds, including a tender. and its grade area, that is the space that you had to shovel coal in, or the coal had to be shoveled in, was 82 square feet, which is about the size of 3 4x8 pieces of plywood laid out flat. And one other thing I'd like to point out why it had to be so slow is it seems to have a lot of counterbalancing issues. In the drive gear here, it just wasn't balanced enough. So it had a tendency to pound down on the rail, and that was not good for the rail. So they had to keep the speed down, otherwise they'd be beaten up on the rail. So extra 3200, off to a bad start. Okay, the little story here of what happened early on. On April 10th, 1918. Sorry about that. I don't know how I got that. The Willimantic operator gives the extra 3200 permission to leave for Putnam. So after 2.5 miles, the mechanical stoker failed and the train stopped. The fireman thus volunteered to shovel coal by hand. But this was exhausting, and he soon tired, and they had to stop again. They just couldn't keep the steam up. So the crew got down and started to poke around, and they found that in the stoker, which is a big screw-like device that pushes coal, that rotates and pushes coal from the tender into the fire. Well, they found a big old broken bolt that had jammed the stoker. So the mechanism there. So they were able to fix it and get the stoker going. But now they were 30 minutes behind schedule. So the point I'd like to emphasize here that in this situation, the operators, the people who control the train, they did not know this had happened. They did not know where 3200 is. They did not know it had been delayed. So 10 minutes after 3200 left, the same operator gave this following train, the AB4, that is the double header, permission to leave Putnam at 1:40. So, and for some reason, which I can't explain, but is interesting, they hung around, the train crew of AB4 hung around for almost a half an hour. They left Willimantic at 2:05. So, because the block is the control area of exclusive control area for the trackage, it had not cleared, meaning the train had not gone all the way to Putnam. So AB4, the following train, was issued a caution card. So what was a caution card? A caution card was considered fair warning to the crew that they may encounter another train on the same track. It put responsibility solely on the train crew, and thereby absolved operators of responsibility for safe passage. Well, that's because, the operators couldn't know where the train was. It was like a ticket into the wilderness, I suppose. So this is a facsimile that I put together from a book of rules from 1914 and some text that I got in the Connecticut Public Utilities Report, showing, like I reiterated here, that 1:10 a.m., the operator, Kelly, gave permission to leave at 1:40 a.m. So let me go over this. This is a blueprint of the track between Elliott and just east of Pomfret. So Willimantic is over on the left. Putnam is over on the right. The trains are going from left to right. And So what this diagram shows is that sections of the track that are straight, tangent, and sections that are curved. So this is that chart. Also, it shows the grade crossing. It shows the layout, including the stations and the spurs, and the grade. So this is elevation on this axis. And what we see from Elliott is that there is a downgrade all the way through Abington, which is where 44 crosses, we're very near where 44 crosses the old airline grade, going down to Pomfret on the flat, and then a 1% upgrade. Now, the wreck occurred right about here at the top of the grade and on a curve to the 1 degree curve. So April 10th, 1918, AB4 collided with the rear of Extra 32. Going about 20 to 25 miles an hour, 4 people died in the wreck, 3 were injured, 1 salvage worker was killed the next day during cleanup operations when his head was crushed. So the county coroner was tasked with investigating the wreck and determining the cause. Mr. or Arthur Bill was the Windham County coroner. He, in his report of June 4th, 1918, stated that the deaths were all caused by the criminal carelessness of Herbert M. Cook, the engineer on the first engine of said train, AB4, and John O'Flaherty, flagman on the first train, Extra 3200. Criminal carelessness. Also, the Interstate Commerce Commission blamed the trainmen too. On May 20th of 1918, the direct cause of this accident was the failure of engineman Cook and Corsair and conductor Pritchard to operate their train under control. And the third report, the state of Connecticut from May 7th, engineman Cook should have so controlled his train all the way from Willimantic to Putnam so as to be able to stop short of any obstruction. So there's a lot of blame here. And this is what the mess looked like. We have a blueprint from the state archives here showing the layout of what the wreck looked like. So first we have the lead mogul, engine 330, and then the following engine, 327, was straddled by the tender, 330 over here, and this tender over on this side. Behind that, we have 3 hopper cars of coal, and then a tangent of about, 8 or so freight cars on the track, and then down the track about, a couple thousand, 1,000 feet or so, or 300 or so feet. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cars off the track. And then the rest of the train was on the track, stayed on the track. So 2 areas of derailment. What is here is the steel frame of the caboose of Extra 3200. Now this caboose burned, and this blueprint doesn't show anything else of Extra 3200. So I'm not sure what it just drove away, or I don't know. There's no other evidence of damage to 3200. So we got some photos from, we went down on a little fishing trip to the state library and found some great photos here. In this case, what we have is the wreck, and at Sugarloaf Cut is this right here. A number of bystanders, including a little one there. We have number 327 on its side, on the right side of the grade. We have 330 here, and we see evidence of fire damage and significant fire damage. It looks like the lagging has gone, the asbestos lagging has off the cylinders. We have a lot of coal here, a lot of coal, probably, well, from the tenders or also from the hoppers. And here it looks like we have a railroad official, which I suspect was a guy, Mr. Woodward, from because his name shows up in some of the newspaper reports. Here's a second picture taken from a different direction, but let me point out here the following following mogul, 327, and a derrick pulling the tenders off the grade. The hopper car, an emptied with coal, I guess, somewhere in here. Three hopper cars, and here we have a coach, which I assume is for the crew, for the work crew that came to clean up these guys. And I also know, well, here is number 330, and it's missing its cab. Don't know what, whether they ripped it off or during the salvage, or I don't know. It certainly there was a big fire here. People are looking at the frame of the burned caboose, staring at it. This is where the two men died, and three men actually. One, the fireman from this locomotive, and the two men that were in the caboose of 3200. So stepping back a little bit, now we're looking towards the Pomfret station. So we're looking to the west. We can see that it's still the same day, but the trackage is almost clear. They've taken a lot of the tenders are all moved out of the way. They still have a lot of people looking. And also, speaking of looking, I don't know what people are doing right here. They seem to be looking at something going on right in front of that hopper car. And there's also a few other interesting details, like a little cart for a section crew here. So I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk about broader issues than the wreck itself. So maybe you remember Paul Harvey. He used to have his radio broadcast, and he'd always give you a preamble, and then he'd say, "Now for the rest of the story." So anyway, now for the rest of the story. So I'm going to explain some of the trends in railroad finances and during this particular time, during the early 20th century. The things like, decrease in revenue, increase in worker rights, and also war, very important factors that the railroad management had to deal with. So they were controlling the ICC, the government was controlling freight rates. And there was an increase in worker rights on the federal and also the state level. And the war, caused a huge increase in traffic, moving lots of munitions and other needed war-related material to Europe. And also because a lot of workers were soldiers, there was a shortage of labor. And the USRA, which basically rented the railroad from the owners, was just beginning. Now here we have a picture of a fellow Eugene Debs, labor activist and also socialist candidate from 1912. Well, it looks like he's on a soapbox here, and he may be talking to a bunch of labor activists, firing them up. He's got a real, let's say, attitude here. So he's one to say much earlier, government ownership of railroads is decidedly better than railroad ownership of government. So he was a bit of a gadfly, I guess. But what was aggravating Mr. Debs? So the consolidation of railroads to lower interroad competition and produce higher profits. Well, by consolidation, meaning increased efficiency through mergers and acquisitions. So the new age of big money was arriving. The age of speculative control, that is by Gould and Fisk and the other financial buccaneers, was passing, and the money man was taken over. So who was the money man? 1, 2, 3 times up. This fellow. So you probably recognize him as J.P. Morgan. He was genuinely believed that he could make the railroads more efficient by consolidating them. And he had control of not just railroads, but other industries like such as steel. And he really didn't like the way the people like Gould and Fisk had operated, and he wanted to change things. So who was his man, JP's man at the New York Haven in Hartford? And I mentioned his name before. This is Charles Mellon, and he was president in the early 20th century. So that was a difficult time. Managing the New Haven became more difficult during the Mellon years. And the result was, well, increased prices for the acquisition, increased construction costs, increased accident rate, and also increased debt from 14 million in 1903 to 242 million in 1913. So, and then on top of that, public anger was getting focused on the railroad, and legislation was being promulgated, antitrust regulation was being promulgated to try to block any sort of monopolistic business practice by these guys, by the railroad. I should mention wartime, of course, as a factor that made it difficult. Most freight was bound for Europe because of the war, and maritime shipping, well, there were U-boats out there, so that was dangerous. So, freight did not easily be transferred, and the freight yards became basically storage tracks. In other words, they brought goods to the east, but they couldn't get them on across the sea. So this also caused a shortage back to the west, that there were not cars available. And complicating things was that the Eastern Railroad didn't really want to run deadhead runs of empty boxcars back to their owner. So it was a difficult time. And on top of that, we're going to focus on labor for telegraph operators specifically, because they have a role in this particular accident. So the telegrapher, their primary job was to communicate with other stations along the railway line. They had a crucial role in coordinating train movements and ensuring safe paths. And they began to organize around this time. And of course, what they wanted, lower hours. They wanted limits on their shift hours. And they wanted, of course, a little more money, a little more wage. So in 1907, state Connecticut statute defined and limited a telegrapher's workday to 8 hours. However, except at stations that are kept open only during the daytime, where only one telegraph or telephone operator is employed, such operator may work 12 hours in the day of 24. So means that the management, the railroad management, could pretty much decide which stations they wanted to close at night and not have a telegrapher on duty in order, I assume, to save money. So this is what the Midland Division run between Willimantic and Putnam could look like here. So we have the rail traffic was controlled by dividing this route into blocks. So there were 7 blocks between Willimantic and Putnam, between each of these stations. So the controllers or the telegraphers were stationed at these boundaries. So North Windham, Clark's Corner, Hampton, and etc. But the distance between Willimantic and Putnam was 25 miles. So, and that was a long way to go. So 4 months before this wreck, the telegraphers had an agreement with management. So December 31st, 1917, they hammered out better wage, better living, better working conditions. They got a little more wage, and they got their hours limited to 8 or 12 hours. So this shows where these 12 hours, these were just daytime telegraphers. Clark's Corners, for example, Hampton, Elliott, Abington, places that I mentioned earlier, and Pomfret. So all these between Willimantic and Putnam. So the railroad had decided to close these offices and just have a person staff them during the day. And they were allowed to do that because of the exception in the state statute. So what did it look like at night after a run? Before a run, a 25-mile run between Willimantic and Putnam? Well, there was no control. No telegrapher was on duty after January 14th, 1918. So not long, a couple weeks after the agreement with the telegrapher, management and the telegrapher. So just to recap the things that I've gone over, some of the key decisions leading up to the wreck are that in July 27th, the railroad lobbied the Connecticut State Legislature, adding the 12-hour exception to the 1907 state statute and limiting working hours for telegraphers. Secondly, December 31st, the labor management agreement with the Order of Railroad Telegraphers came into effect. January 14th, as I mentioned, management eliminated overnight telegraph stations at intermediate control points. And then April 10th, the decision to curtail staffing at intermediate control points made it necessary to issue a caution card to the trainmen of AB4. And so, what was this guy say? I told you so. And he's right. I think. Maybe you agree. So let's talk. We talked about blame. Again, let's go back to that and discuss fault. Can we blame the trainmen of AB4, the flagmen of Extra 3200, or railroad management for this accident? Well, the enginemen of AB4 were accused of criminal negligence, but they were ordered to proceed into unusual and dangerous circumstances. At least that's my opinion. Also, the flagmen of Extra 3200, despite what we see here, the fellow who was killed, was not negligent, as he was not ordered to, quote, protect the rear of the train, because his train's progress was unhindered when the wreck occurred. You know, usually the engineer would give a signal to the brakeman when he wanted that to happen, when he wanted the rear of the train to be protected. Well, this didn't happen. The train was moving at probably 15 miles an hour, or close to it, as it was supposed to. So the bottom line is, if the telegrapher had been on duty at any of these intermediate control points, the wreck would have been prevented. That's my opinion, but it also seems to be what the Interstate Commerce Commission said in their report. So a circumstance which beyond question contributed to the accident was the length of the block in which it occurred. So one more thing to bring to light here is that in reference to the accident which occurred at Pomfret, management wrote a letter to say that they're changing their mind. They're now having more people, they're having telegraph staffing overnight at intermediate stations between Willimantic and Putnam. So after June 2nd, 1918, we had telegraphers at 24-hour staffing at Willimantic, and then also at Clark's Corners, then Hampton, then Abington, and then Pomfret, and then through Putnam. So, so my question here is, why did it take almost 3 months for management to respond from April 10th to June 2nd? And I note that it's just circumstantial, but I note that the date of this letter that the railroad was quite sure that the state of Connecticut, the ICC, or the county coroner had not implicated railroad management. So they wanted, basically, someone else took the blame. So I'd like to thank the people who helped me with this, including the staff at the Connecticut State Library, and also my friend, longtime friend, Dr. Larry Goodhart, Emeritus Professor of American History, and also Janet Booth, my colleague at the Pomfret Historical Society, for her original artwork. And that is it.
Before you stop your share, Stewart, we do have one question in the Q&A. I think you need to go back to the diagram that showed the position of the wrecked cars and locomotives.
Yeah.
And the question is, and I don't remember the answer from having seen it before. Yeah, right there. So the question was, did the lead engine get completely turned around in the wreck?
Yes.
So it was engine 327 was the lead locomotive in that concept.
No, so you can see the 330 is complete. Here's the pilot. So it was completely turned around. And its tender ended up over here.
Oh, okay. Oh, trains were going from left to right. Okay.
Trains are going this way. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So that should answer that question.
Well, there's Tom Engel asked about how fast the trains were going, and Stewart said it was about 25 miles an hour. The AB4.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But wasn't AB4, what was their caution card instruction?
Well, it's pretty simple. Just don't hit a train from behind.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, it's pretty simple text. Conductors and enginemen receiving this card properly filled out and signed by the signalman may proceed with the train under control, prepared to stop short of any obstruction in the block.
Okay. I'm not seeing any other open questions here. So at this point, thank you, Stewart, for interesting and somewhat provocative program. And some of the causes that were found of that are quite interesting. And as I thought about the program and preparing the notice of the presentation, I thought, well, what's so special about this? There's lots of train wrecks where one train plows into the rear of another in the past century, and but I think there's a lot more to this in terms of railroad operations at the time that add to the story, and certainly not the emphasis on safety that most railroads have today.
That's true. I concur with that, and I'm glad I got that message across, because it is an issue. I think that the railroads were having a really difficult time making a profit at this time, and they were cutting costs and sacrificing safety. And it was a tough time for the workers too, because they were stressed and overworked and underpaid.
Okay, we do have a question here. Can you describe more exactly the wreck location in terms of modern day landmarks?
Yes, I can do that.
Questioner asked, if I understand correctly, it was between the modern station and Needles High Road. Is that correct?
That's correct. But I can be more precise than that. I've led a tour down here. Let's go back to that blueprint of the wreck. So there's two things to note. I have other blueprints too. Two things that exist. First of all, is this cast iron pipe right here. And then also there's a survey mark that still are present, that were present on this map, on this blueprint, and also on today, maps on my GPS app. So I can find where the survey markers were. I can find the cast iron pipe. And when I find the cast iron pipe, I know that that's the position of the first car that was not derailed. and that the wreckage was strewn ahead of this cast iron culvert, which is still there. And it is on a curve, and you know, it's perfectly accessible. It's not hard to find, but there's really nothing left that you can see that tells you that there was a wreck here. It's all
Other than the survey marker in the pipe, that's
yeah,
landmarks where you can find where it was.
yeah. I have it GPS.
So now we have another question that kind of, I suppose the answer is somewhat dependent on a lot of conditions, including weather. But how close would AB4 get before they can spot the end markers on the caboose and determine that both were on the same track?
That was spelled out in the report. I can't remember actually how many feet they estimated, but I think it was around 300 feet, 300 to 500 feet. The other complicating factor was just that it was on a curve.
Right. Somebody just mentioned that in the Q&A.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions before we move on? Not seeing any, we'll take them up in the informal chat. So again, Stewart, I'd like to thank you for your presentation tonight. And with that, we will end the recording.
Thank you, Stewart. That was very informative.